Thank you for watching this podcast. I'm joined by Jonathan Brearley, the CEO of Ofgem, and Antony Ainsworth, the CEO of npower Business Solutions. Today, we're going to delve deeper into policy as we've been doing all day. Earlier on, you would have heard from our interview with Lord Hunt. One of the things that's happened with Labour, as you've seen, is a plethora of changes. Just a few highlights. The creation of GB Energy, the target to get the grid net zero by 2030, the ban on offshore wind being lifted, the creation of a sort of separate entity, in fact, nationalising the grid distribution, the massive influx of money into CCS, tons of policy changes and plenty more to come. We've got the budget at the end of the month. What we're going to cover in this podcast is two areas with our guests. One area is kind of all these policies mean regulation. So how do we ensure that we as consumers and businesses in particular are regulated fairly through this transition? And for businesses who are listening, end users, energy end users, suppliers, they're going to have to implement a lot of this and they're going to have to stump up the cash. So is this policy landscape good, or is it still bringing in more uncertainty? So Jonathan, let's start with you. Ofgem's role has shifted as the years have gone by, right?
Absolutely.
And now, big time. And you've been there, what, is it 4 years now? I can't remember how long you've been there, mate.
4 years, nearly five.
Nearly five. And in that time, endless prime ministers, I wouldn't even count how many. But in general terms, there has been some certainty, which is a commitment to net zero and the sort of more of the fragmentation of what was the supply sector. And we've obviously had the big pressures from Ukraine and so on. Have you been surprised at the speed? You probably knew what government was going to do, but have you been surprised at the speed that they've put these announcements out?
Well, I don't think I've been surprised, because I think that the party had been signalling publicly for a long time that there were some big pillars they wanted to get in place. So GB Energy is not a surprise, 2030 is not a surprise. But what I would say is that Secretary of State, so Ed Miliband, has sort of generated what I think is an incredibly positive atmosphere around his agenda. So when I talk to the department and we start, getting into the plumbing about how all this is going to really work, there is definitely amongst all of us actually a mindset of, if we are going to achieve something like 2030, for example, we're just going to need to surface problems and work through them much more quickly. And all of us coming into the room with the mindset that actually whatever it takes, we will do. So, the interesting thing for me is not just sort of what the Secretary of State has said, but appointing Chris Stark from the Committee on Climate Change originally to come in and run what they're describing as mission control, again, just gives us all a locus to make sure that we can work further at pace. And when I go out across the industry, when I talk to the network companies, for example, or I talk to the generators, there's a real sense of excitement there. And that's what we need to build on. What I see from this new government, which I think as a broad position is not that different from the previous government, which is, look, we've had years of gradually getting to net zero. We've had a high dependency on gas. We know the last 3 years, fundamentally, all the distress that has been caused, with many lessons for all of us, including Ofgem, has really been around what happened after Russia invaded Ukraine and the manipulation of the markets that we saw internationally. So for me, what Ed says to me is that the economic case now for this net zero transition is much, much stronger. So I think there is a focus on a goal. I think that is a good way of making sure all of us can work together to deliver it. But the underlying economics of why are really clear. We want a system that is more stable and less prone to the sorts of things we've seen in the last 3 years. Now, as I say to people often, Europe spent, I think, up to €1 trillion to try and manage the gas crisis. And that was to keep bills double what they were before the crisis hit.
Absolutely.
Europe.
Yeah.
So, given that context, what can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Antony, your first reactions, because obviously, you're one of those companies that's been around, you've seen all the transitions yourself, and now this government has come back and tried to do a reset. Have you been surprised, or again, like Jonathan, were you expecting them to do so many different policy changes straight from the off?
Well, I certainly give them an A for effort for the first 100 days in terms of everything that they have done and the speed that they've done it. But again, I'd agree with Jonathan and say there's probably no surprises individually there, but as a collective effort, I think it's pretty huge and a really big push to do all those things. I think the challenge is going to be to coordinate those policies and the things that sit outside of the energy sector, such as the planning regulations will need to change. That's been signalled, but without that, I think it would really struggle. The businesses that I looked after are responsible for something like 16% of GDP in the UK. So we're really close to what's important to them, and agreeing with what you said. So if you're a CFO,
yep,
you want lower cost energy for sure. If you're a COO, you want a reliable supply and a robust supply chain to go with it. Want your stakeholders happy and decarbonize as fast as possible. So those three things really work in tandem, and there is a lot of support for business to play their part. The surveys that we do with our business say they're absolutely behind it, but what they need, I think this is behind your question, Sumit, what they need is a clear and consistent policy landscape that they can get behind and then invest.
Don't we all, Antony? Don't we all? I mean, that is the point, though, isn't it? I challenged Lord Hunt, and he said, you're being a bit cynical, which is the nature of my game. But, I hear from businesses. Jonathan, you talk to them. Antony, they're your customers. And all of them say, this is all very good. But what we're concerned about is changing and shifting. And God, there's been so many shifts in the last 4 years. But also in the post-COVID, where people are still recovering, we know the economics aren't great. And yes, we'll have to wait for the budget. But a lot of them are still not sure whether they'll go and do the investment because they've got that thing to say the government is going to back us. So let's just tick on that first point there, which is, this kind of sentiment in business. Jonathan, you said you think there's been a reset and you think people are kind of more positive because there's a framework. Is that in the kind of, dare I say, the lovely chattering classes and the towers of Westminster and policy world, or is it out there when you're talking to businesses?
So look, it's worth, again, just thinking about some of the journeys we're going on as a sector, actually, which this government is, yes, accelerating, but they've been pointing in this direction for a long time. So I think, Sumit, you mentioned in your opener the setup of the National Energy System Operator.
Yeah.
Now, we had a fair, not luxurious, we had a long plan for them to deliver a strategic plan for the country. Now, clearly this government's come in and said, look, we need to get to 2030. We need to do this much more quickly. But coming out of that, with their advice roughly going to government in October, then the government have to consider it and come back with its final version. You are going to have something that is going to show, for example, roughly where the generation is going to be and what the wires are that we need across the country to make all of that possible. Now, already we have the regulation in place that allows the money to flow to the network companies to build out. So very pragmatically, yes, they are already gearing up to provide that investment. So you'll have seen, for example, National Grid did an equity rights issue, which was all about getting ready to put the capital in to do the things that need to be done. Other companies are thinking about their own capital strategies to do this. So it's worth one thing before I go on to how we're doing it. I mean, this is also a massive shift in the regulator. So I'm sure you remember sort of 10 years ago, you and I be having a conversation when I was outside of Ofgem,
of course,
saying, why aren't they approving any wires? Why is it taking so long to get anything built? This is what I say to my board quite regularly. Now, we have shifted as a board because now we understand that the costs of delay are material. So this isn't just a case of should we invest or not. It's a case of if we don't invest, you can see it today. Constraint costs are going to go up. Connections are going to get harder. We're not going to have a functioning system. So we have moved to drive this investment, not just because of government goals, but because we fundamentally believe this is in consumers' interest. The job for all of us now, and this is really important in the network space, is delivering on time and to budget. So where this could go wrong for customers is if network companies start saying, well, I said it was 2029, now it's June 2030, now it's December 2030, and we are going to be very hawkish about delivery because we are investing tens of billions of pounds of customers' money in building this new system, and it only really works if you get it on time.
Are you concerned about that, Antony? You go there, you're with a customer, you say you've got a solution for them, and then you go, well, we can provide you the solar panels, or we can give you the heat pumps, we can do whatever, create this thing, but I can't get you connected.
It's certainly a challenge, and you look at the amount of renewables that we need to build and connect nationally, whether it's onshore, offshore, solar, wind, whatever. That is going to be a big challenge without the change of the planning regulations locally. And I think, as I said to you last time we spoke, this is something that needs to be done on a national basis. and everybody needs to think about the national position here. We've done this before in history over the last 100 years as technology and energy changes. It's another opportunity to do that. And if we get it right, this energy transition, not only does it create energy jobs, which will be fantastic, it'll also help businesses be competitive, protect jobs and help them grow. But more than that, it'll actually deliver benefit for the country as a whole with regenerating communities, better health outcomes for people, more affordable, abundant energy. Those are all fantastic things, but it will only happen if there is a really coordinated push and consistent policy.
Are you being listened to, Antony, do you think?
It's always a challenge. I mean, so whether it's Jonathan, the regulators, or Desnes or others, I think their job is to take soundings from many people,
of course,
and try and balance all of those things. But we've been very consistent in what we've said over the last few years about incentivizing businesses to invest, because that is what they do. That is part of the business cycle. So incentivize them to invest, and they've done that with capital allowances. Be consistent with policy. Make sure that there's a carrot there, but don't be afraid to use the stick as well. Don't be afraid to make it more expensive or more difficult to do the things that we don't want to see in the future.
Look, we all know what happened in the energy price crisis, and you've talked about that and where there were slip-ups, and I don't want to go over that again. But I think, the interviews I do, people are going, there's a lot of change coming. So you're going to have to, as the boss of Ofgem, make sure the regulations are in place as we do more distributed energy, as we have batteries being put in. How's that storage connected? What's the safety in it? How's that all going to go? What are we going to have in terms of kind of prosumer hubs? All of this stuff that's been discussed, the cyber side, all of that. When we've spoken in the past, you've said, we got things wrong, we changed, but also there's an issue of resourcing. Do you feel you're ready to put in enough resourcing so that you can regulate to ensure my rights and business rights as consumers are protected? Because this change will happen pretty fast if what Labour says comes true. So the question is, can you keep up with it?
Well, look, there's kind of, I think, two parts to that. So, what do we take out the crisis? Obviously, we need to financially regulate the retailers. We're doing that now. But you also then look at the retail market, but not only the retail market. I think we are changing our approach to that in the short and medium term. So we came out about a few weeks ago and said, look, we're not simply going to rely on the market. We are going to make sure that we lay out really clearly what the outcomes are we seek from the sector. And we're going to be putting in place a different kind of regulatory ecosystem to make sure that happens. So, Sumit, the way I describe this as to where we are today is when you look at the retailer license, quite often a problem emerges, Ofgem investigates, and then a whole new set of rules appear in the license. And that's been an incremental process. It's what most regulators do. But at some point, you've got to step back and say, well, OK, what are the outcomes that we seek from today's market? Now, the point you make is the one that I am concerned about, which is actually, Ofgem was designed originally for a world where you had a retailer selling you something out of a plug and a pipe.
Correct. A very simple world. Absolutely.
Right. And you had markets behind there and networks to deliver it. And as you say, we hope and expect that people are going to get their energy potentially from their car, from a battery. They're going to be trading in the market themselves through demand side response and aggregators potentially. They're going to have solar panels. They're going to have all these different forms of energy. And I think one question is, are we resourced to deliver that? Well, I think we are for some of the issues today, but there's a big conversation with Her Majesty's Treasury about how we change in the future.
Yeah.
But what we don't have right now are sufficient powers to be able to protect consumers in that market. So, for example, let me give you sort of a theoretical example. Somebody has an installation that goes wrong, a battery installation that goes wrong. Ofgem's powers and where we intervene are quite limited, actually.
This is it. Exactly. Yeah.
And I think it's even deeper than that. I think we're going to have to think through a new and different way of regulating. And I suspect, we are talking to the government about reform of the regulator itself. We are going to need a different legislative basis to make some of those changes. So what I'd like to see, for example, is a move from where we are today, where we all identify an issue. Heat networks, good example. Government says we need someone to regulate. Government thinks about it a bit more and says probably that's Ofgem. Government then writes legislation, designs the scheme, and we're still in the process of implementation several years after the problem's been identified. I would like to see more flexibility for the regulator to be able to intervene in these new energy markets on a more, with criteria, but on a more adaptable basis. So I think you're going to need that. I also think, we've done what we can within the powers we have to address the risks in the gas crisis, but I don't think we've addressed them all. So I've said, for example, we need to think about executive accountability. We need to make sure that shareholders of residual companies who make money are held to account. There's all sorts of things we need, which means I think when you step back from it all, Ofgem could look a bit more like the FCA in some aspects.
Yeah.
I don't want to overplay that. It's a much bigger market, and they have much more extensive regulation. So you're going to need to do that. And look, on the infrastructure side, as I say, we've got to build out a pace to make sure we align with the plans that are there.
Jonathan, are you worried? Because you've just outlined it. All the things that I was thinking is that you're going to have transport, right? Legislation around transport. You're going to have housing legislation, right? Integrity of a boiler or a heat pump, this is all part of the energy system now. Am I being dealt fairly when I trade? All of these things. You've got pretty much, of the way I see it, energy, transport, housing, let alone environment, all having to combine together to get us to this zero goal. There isn't that clear definition of what's what in this new world, whereas you are operating to very clear regulatory frameworks. You're going to have to change, aren't you?
We are, and I think, to be honest, not only.
But you can't. You're going to have to let government make that change for you.
Yes, we are. So, there is a conversation to be had about additional powers that we might need. And you'll notice in the manifesto, they said that they were looking at different powers for the regulator.
Yeah.
In my mind, that's the heart of that conversation. And I think, where the imagination is going to have to come in is how do we regulate for a world that is much more fragmented? So even if we could solve the scope question, which I think is one that needs to be addressed, how do we intervene in a way that protects customers' interests, but also, and Sumit, you'll want us to do this, to make sure these markets continue to innovate?
Of course.
So, what we don't want to do is to slam so hard on every single thing that's happening that we don't get the change that we need to see. So in my mind, I see a change in what we can do, likely to involve governmental change, but also a change in the nature of what Ofgem is. And I think those are big conversations we're beginning to have. But for me, that is what you want from a 2030 regulator, a regulator that's ready for this world that we're building out, where, of course, you've got all the big stuff, and that's hard enough, but you've got customers on the end of this very different system who need to be protected in a very different way.
I would just say we'd be very supportive of that as well. We'd love to see the regulatory frameworks evolve, and I think something that is principle led and co-designed with the industry, because we're the ones that have got to make it happen and invest, etc. So
Absolutely
working together and designing these things and being held to account, I think is a way forward here that we would really support.
I want to talk to you, Antony, about, before we end, we've got a few minutes left, bureaucracy, right? Now, this is the thing. As things change, and I'm going to blame Jonathan for this, he won't mind. But, there'll be more laws, there'll be more regulations. You have to navigate them. You as a company, you're providing solutions. That's what you call it. But they're across the board, from vehicle to grid, to solar, to storage, to direct power purchase agreements. There's a plethora of things. For you to solve the issues your customers want, Antony, you say, I want to decarbonize, I want a smorgasbord of different things. But you go, oh, hang on, I could get you that, but I can't get that. And this policy, oh my God, there's a lot of red tape. What do you want to see from government and regulators to make that process easier for you, without not letting you get in free pass? You still got to be held accountable, but also to help your consumers and customers.
The pain and problems away. But again, clear regulation, consistent regulation, breaking down the barriers for planning, speeding up connections, all of those kind of things are going to help move these things forward. And I'm a big fan of history, and therefore I'm a big fan of technology will find a way. We will move forward in great leaps over the next few years as we collectively learn more. Cost of technology comes down. I can't solve things for 10 years time, but I can solve things for the next couple of years. And then you learn a lot more, and you go again and you go again. And if we've got a relationship with a regulator and stakeholders that is co-designing this together, I think there's a far greater opportunity of this working than perhaps it might have done in the past.
Before we go, businesses will be waiting. Everyone is waiting for the budget, and that's going to be in a couple of weeks' time. But whatever happens, there are certain blocks that are now set in place. This is kind of to both of you. Would you say that there's now a clearer picture, albeit we know things change in government, but there's actually a clearer defined picture? Because the thing that, Jonathan, in the previous life you had before that, when you were out in the field, you remember conversations I've had with loads of people saying things change, or, oh gosh, I wish I just had some certainty, or if we could just plan, if we knew what we were going to do. Labour's kind of set its stall to be the net zero government. Do you both feel that there is now a set, not a defined pathway, but at least a pathway that you can say, right, this is the way we're going to go with some certainty? Jonathan first, please.
So I think what have we learned in I'm getting long in the tooth here, 20 odd years in the energy industry in one form or another. We've moved over time from trying to be entirely market-based to one that is becoming increasingly strategically planned, actually. So when I describe that strategic plan that's coming out for 2030, roughly by the end of the year, let's say, that is going to give us a very firm basis on which we can work. And I think that the clearest strategic steer I think the system has ever had since the CGB, bluntly. So I think you are going to see that emerging on the infrastructure side, and I'm quite optimistic about that. Actually, I'm on the kind of positive end of the sense of, can we get there, or can we get to the goals that have been set? And that I think is something that becomes a delivery challenge rather than a systems planning challenge. You then got the inevitable debate about what market you have around it, and we haven't got time here, but should we have zones? Should we have a national market? All that to come. I think for me, where the work that needs to be done still is on what happens to consumers in this world. So what kind of retailer, is it a retailer anymore? Are we bundling now with other products? All those questions. And I think, we've still got short, medium and long-term issues in retail. Retail is still tough. Customers' lives are still tough out there. Affordability is a major issue not for everybody, but for a certain set of our society who really do struggle to pay their bills. We've got standards to raise today, so you can get the good service from your suppliers that you deserve, and from all companies, frankly, that you deserve. But the medium and long term is really a question of commercial and market design around what does that different market look like, and how do we both legislate and regulate for that? And I think that is the unanswered question. And if I had one sort of question about getting to 2030, in my noddy head, I haven't seen any plans or anything yet, my simple world, if you can use flex of demand and storage a lot, it seems to me it'll be a lot cheaper than if you can't use very much of it at all. And what is the way in which we're going to make that happen? And I think that's a big question we need to wrestle with over the next 5 years.
Antony, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'd say 5 years of a Labour government is a long time to get plenty of things done. So, as I said at the start, an A for effort so far. And the energy transition can be a force for good. It can be a force for good for growth, for jobs, for better outcomes. So all very positive, and businesses are really willing to play their part and invest. They just need that consistency and certainty of policy and cuts, and business will get behind it.
Brilliant. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We're out of time, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on this podcast, Jonathan Brearley and Antony Ainsworth.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.